and visit our website at the Battle of Gettysburg Podcast.com to shop, buy some new merch, check in on our upcoming events, and of course, buy Civil War books from one of your favorite podcasters. Make sure you check out our friends at the Research Arsenal, proud supporters of the Battle of Gettysburg Podcast.
Hi everyone, Jim Hessler, Battle of Gettysburg Podcast, and we are on the road again. We are at Fort Abraham Lincoln State Park in Mandan, North Dakota, which is near Bismarck. Now, Fort Abraham Lincoln was home of the 7th Cavalry, the last post that George Armstrong Custer would have been in before departing on the fateful Little Bighorn expedition. I'm joined by a longtime friend, a listener, and dare I say super fan.
Oh, I would say so.
I love it. Super fan Jeff Hoffer. Super fan Scott is lingering around somewhere, but he is elected. He's shy not to go on camera. Jeff, though, is a longtime interpreter in the area, and he is going to give us a little bit of a guided tour today of the post. Do you want to just tell people for a minute what's here and what we might see?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, first off, welcome aboard. It's great to have everybody here at Fort Abraham Lincoln State Park. This is a gem if you've never been here before, and if you're interested in not just the Indian Wars, but the Civil War too. There's so many great stories to be had out here at this park. The men who served here, the experiences that occurred here. It's really tremendous, and we actually made some pretty significant inroads in doing some reconstructions, which we're going to see. Not least of which is the structure behind me, the Kuster House, which is a reconstruction of the second home that George and Libby lived in while they were here in 1873, all the way to his death in 1876. We also have opposite the officers' row, where the crown jewel is the commanding officer's residence, we have the enlisted barracks, of which there was 3. One of them was reconstructed again in 1989, and we'll also see back behind us a building that's used for storage now, but had a utilitarian purpose back in the day, and that was the granary. So there's no shortage of things to see here at the Cavalry Post at Fort Abraham Lincoln State Park, and I think you guys are going to like it.
Well, I'm a long-time Little Bighorn Custer enthusiast, as most people know, but I have never been here before, so I can't wait to see what we've got, and Jeff is the guy to do it, so he's going to show us around.
Looking forward to it.
Before we start looking around at Fort Abraham Lincoln, a reminder that, yes, this is the Battle of Gettysburg podcast, and generally speaking, we try to stay in the Gettysburg lane most of the time, but our Little Bighorn videos have been among our most popular, and that's great. But for any Gettysburg students who are watching, here is a brief reminder of some of the Gettysburg Little Bighorn connections. First of all, as we well know, Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer was, in 1863, a recently promoted brevet brigadier general, and of course he led a brigade of Michigan cavalry at Gettysburg. But on top of that, you have other officers, such as Captain Miles Keogh, who was killed commanding I Company with Custer and was on John Buford's staff during the Gettysburg campaign. You also have Captain George Yates. He was killed commanding F Company with Custer, and he was on Alfred Pleasanton's staff at Gettysburg. On the enlisted side, you have guys like Sergeant John Ryan, who was serving in Company M of the 7th Cavalry. Now, he survived the Battle of Little Bighorn with Marcus Reno. At Gettysburg, Ryan was a young private in the 28th Massachusetts of the Irish Brigade near the wheat field and was probably in the ranks on July 2nd. There is some debate about that. The infamous Marcus Reno, Major Reno, he was on staff in the Carlisle area after a New York City wedding on the morning of July 1st, 1863. There are a host of other Civil War connections within the officer ranks of the 7th Cavalry, a few others within the enlisted ranks, such as Henry Brinkerhoff, who might be a local guy, and several significant campaign connections, such as John Gibbon. So all in, there are plenty of reasons why Little Bighorn has relevance to a Gettysburg podcast, besides the fact that it's the pet topic of your host. So as we start our walkthrough of Fort Abraham Lincoln State Park, or Fort Abe as Jeff likes to call it, just a few words about its history. So this is a state park. It is located about 7 miles south of Mandan, North Dakota. And today the park is home to both a replica Mandan Indian village as well as reconstructed military buildings, including what is generally known as the Kuster House. So the buildings we're looking at are reconstructions. They are not originals. But it sits on the site of what was originally Fort McKeen. So Fort McKeen, as it was initially known, was established here in Dakota Territory in the summer of 1872 as an infantry post. Now this was on location where a Mandan Indian tribe had established a village in the late 1500s and where they lived until a smallpox outbreak had decreased their population and forced them to relocate. This was a nice location. It was near the confluence of the Missouri and the Heart Rivers, and so the infantry post was established on the same site of the Indian village, as I said, in 1872. Now, also near this fort was the fledgling town, and of course later the city, of Bismarck, North Dakota, which was also established in the early 1870s. The Civil War was followed by a boom in railroad construction, and the industry was the country's largest non-agricultural employer. Now, some of the railroad industry's rapid growth was fueled by large amounts of speculative investment, and much of that crashed in the economic panic of 1873. But nevertheless, beginning in the 1870s, the Northern Pacific Railroad pushed westward from Minnesota into Dakota Territory and beyond. Railroads brought settlement, economic development, and millions of settlers into lands that the tribes considered to be their own. And understandably, the tribes such as the Lakota were very angry by this, and they were harassing the surveying parties, the railroads, and the settlers. Therefore, you needed the army on the ground to protect everybody. It was soon realized that the less mobile infantry alone would be inadequate to protect the railroads. So in November of 1872, the fort was expanded to include a cavalry post and renamed at that time Fort Abraham Lincoln. A large number of permanent wooden structures were built on Fort Lincoln at that time, and by 1873, the 7th Cavalry moved into the fort as their new home. And yes, the first post commander of the expanded Fort Lincoln was Lieutenant Colonel George Custer, and he would hold that position until his death in 1876. Libby Kuster and others would write about this period somewhat romantically, but really the period at Fort Lincoln from 1873 until 1876 really does represent the glory days of Custer's 7th Cavalry on the plains. As military historians and enthusiasts, we often tend to think of these forts in military terms. But it has been said, and I think it's important to remember, that people lived here, officers, who usually get most of the attention from historians, but enlisted men. In some cases, their families were with them, and you would have had assorted people also working on post. So now that we have a little bit of background about Fort Abe, let's turn it over to Jeff as he's going to show us the site of some of the officers' quarters.
While the commanding officer's residence is a single-family dwelling, we'll get into, I'll let the folks with the Kuster House tour tell you about how the house changed from its War Department plans through the ages, as it were, through the years. But these homes here were actually duplexes, all right? One side being a mirror image of the other. Okay. And they were a couple of stories tall, pretty stately looking wood frame homes. We don't know for sure, but the rumor is that Tom Custer lived in this structure.
Wow. And so you'd have one family on one side, another family on the other side, and they occupied both
right.
floors.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. It was the quarters was pretty much split right up the middle.
Okay.
And they would have a cellar, or something of that nature.
Yeah.
And so you could put like preserves and smoked meats and whatever down there. The kitchen would have been at the back, and there was a service road behind all of these buildings that would do things like deliver water, deliver fuel, pick up trash, and in some cases, they're actually probably every building here on Officers Row, you can find trash pits, bits of broken plates and stuff like buttons, stuff is back there.
Have they done archaeological digs on these things?
There was archaeology that was conducted up to and probably including 1989 before they conducted these restorations these reconstructions.
Okay.
By the way, that stylishly dressed gentleman in the blue polka dots who you're going to see occasionally come onto camera, that's our friend Casey Turbin from Addressing Winchester, who is doing some camera work for us on this trip. And you might also recognize the voice of our friend and esteemed Civil War historian Wayne Motz, who is not shy about asking questions. Well, enough about us for now anyways. Let's get over to what Jeff referred to as the crown jewel of the fort, which of course is known today as the Kuster House. This impressive two-story frame structure is easily the best-known building in the fort, even though Custer only lived in the house for about 3 years, again from 1873 to 1876. As I said before, Libby Kuster wrote extensively about this period, particularly in her well-known book, Boots and Saddles. And let's pick up with Libby's description of what she saw the first time she was brought to this house, or to the original house that stood on site. And we'll talk more about that in a minute.
Our brother, Colonel Tom, met us and drove us to our new home. In the dim light, I could see the great post of Fort Lincoln, where only a few months before we had left a barren plain. Our quarters were lighted, and as we approached, the regimental band played Home Sweet Home, followed by the General's favorite, Gary Owen. The General had completely settled the house before he left for the East, but he had kept this fact secret as a surprise. Our friends had lighted it all and built fires in the fireplaces. The garrison had gathered to welcome us, and Mary had a grand supper ready. How we chatted and gloried over the regiment having a home at last. It seemed too good to believe that the 7th Cavalry had a post of its own, with room for half of the regiment assigned to duty there.
Loyal listeners of our podcast will no doubt recognize the voice of none other than superfan Jody, who is doing double duty on this video as the voice of Libby Kuster. Now, Jody was not able to travel out to North Dakota with us, but I'm glad that she's able to contribute to this video nonetheless, because quite frankly, she probably makes a more convincing Libby Kuster than my voice would. As the camera does a 360 pan back to the house, one of the things that I love on this style of house is, of course, that large front and wraparound porch. Now, you can imagine a house like this, the commander's house. The Kuster House would have served as one of the centers of social activity on the post. And one of the things that the Kusters and their inner circle, or the Kuster clan, as it's sometimes called, one of the things they clearly enjoyed doing was having their pictures taken in front of the house on the porch. I'm going to show you a couple of those images that survive today. And of course, as I'm sure most Custer enthusiasts do, we couldn't resist taking our picture on the porch as well to try to recreate that atmosphere, that aura of the Custer clan. Now, some of you who are not familiar with the story might notice that in some of the period photos that I'm showing you, the house does look different. In some of the photos, you see a large bay window on the side of the house, the porch is bigger, and so on. That's because, as probably most good Custer enthusiasts know, the first house was destroyed by a fire on February 6th, 1874. You can imagine in these harsh Dakota winters, keeping the house warm was a problem. And apparently the first house had a faulty chimney. Let's have Libby, pick up the story from here.
We had hardly finished arranging our quarters when, one freezing night, I was awakened by a roaring sound in a chimney that had been defective from the first. Women have such a rooted habit of smelling smoke and sending men on needless investigating trips in the dead of night that I tried to keep still for a few moments. The sound grew too loud to be mistaken, and I awakened my husband. He ran upstairs and found the room above us on fire. He called to me to bring him some water, believing he could extinguish it himself. While I hurried after the water, there came such a crash and explosion that my brain seemed to reel from fright. I had no thought but that my husband was killed. Nothing can describe the relief with which I heard his voice calling back to my agonized question as to his safety. His escape was very narrow. The chimney had burst, the whole side of the room was blown out, and he was covered with plaster and surrounded with fallen bricks.
Now, I have to admit, at this point, I'm having a hard time picturing George Custer covered in plaster. But fortunately, he did survive the fire, and we can imagine how this period of American Western history might have differed if Custer had died in a fire 2 years before Custer's last stand. The house was rebuilt and was back in operation by the spring of 1875. This time with some modifications, including the larger porch, the aforementioned bay window, both of which show up so prominently in the photographs, and some other modifications made primarily for entertainment purposes. So to make a long story not so short at this point, it's the second Kuster House, the Kuster House that was rebuilt after the fire, that was then recreated and rebuilt at Fort Abraham Lincoln State Park in 1989, and it's that house that sits on the site today. Now, just one more word before we finally get into the house itself. We did have a tour guide from Fort Abraham Lincoln State Park who guided us through the house. I did record portions of his tour, but I'm not going to put his tour up on YouTube. He did a great job. The reason I'm not going to put the tour up on YouTube is because I'm a battlefield guide at Gettysburg, and I hate when people record and put our tours up on YouTube without our consent. So out of respect for the Fort Lincoln guide, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to put his tour on YouTube. However, I am going to use some of the audio and video just to help guide us through the house as he did. As we now enter the house, a brief shot of the front hallway, which would have greeted the Custers and their guests as they entered the home. Off to the left is the parlor. Now, many of you have probably seen this image before. It's said to be July 1875. Assembled officers, I can see Tom Custer, among others, assembled here in the parlor, listening to some music. According to our guide, in the first house, the parlor was about half of this size. So expanding the parlor was one of the modifications, one of the changes they made when they rebuilt the house after the fire. We have to remember that these people were stationed out in Dakota Territory, out in the wilderness. Yes, the fledgling town of Bismarck was nearby, but this was not an area with its gambling, prostitution, bars that the Custers would have wanted to see their men and officers frequenting. So it makes sense you're going to have a big entertainment space in the commander's home. Our guide also informed us that those red drapes on the two windows may have in fact belonged to Elizabeth Custer. So despite the relative opulence of the Kuster House, we have to remember that this was a harsh frontier existence. We talked about the role that a defective chimney played in burning down the first house. You've noticed the fireplace and maybe a few other chimneys on this new house. You might think the Custers had an easier time keeping warm during those harsh Dakota winters. Not so, according to Libby Kuster.
But though our quarters were plastered, the unseasoned lumber was warped, and it was a struggle to keep warm. It seemed to require the entire time of one man to keep up the fires. It was thus a blessed thing for the poor fellow, whose duty it was, for he had never been able to remain long with his company at a time. He had an uncontrollable habit of drinking.
From here, we moved into the dining room area with some anecdotes about how the soldiers had to provide their own vegetables and George Custer's own particular love of raw onions. We also see some other necessities, so to speak. Then we move into the kitchen. The kitchen, again, is what I would think more opulent than you would expect to find on a frontier post. Certainly, Libby did not do the cooking and cleaning. It is well known, it is well established that the Custers paid a couple of African-American servants to work, to cook and clean for them. Apparently, they also paid these servants to cook and clean for Tom as well. So not only did George and Libby Kuster have assistants, but Tom Kuster, the bachelor, did as well.
Items over here like old-fashioned irons, old-fashioned waffle maker, and we even have a platter over here that we think may belong to the Custer family, donated to us on a permanent basis by the Custer estate back in Monroe, Michigan. But we do know for sure that the cellar down there is the original cellar from the house that first burned down, then rebuilt on top of, and rebuilt on top of once more in 1989. So that is where they would have stored their food and kept cool using blocks of ice broken up from the frozen Missouri winter and stored in an ice house.
Now, on the Battle of Gettysburg podcast, we occasionally do a little feature that we like to call Custer's Corner. It's kind of similar to the Sickles Report, but it's never really caught on like the Sickles Report has. Nevertheless, here's a picture of the Custer's breakfast nook, and I like to think of this as Custer's Corner, perhaps where George sat every morning, ate his raw onion, drank his milk, while he pondered and planned for the day's activities. From the kitchen, we worked our way upstairs through the servants' quarters, and it passed a couple of bedrooms, what would have been guest rooms, where we saw lots of period clothing, and more clothing, and more clothing, before we finally made our way into what I thought was the coolest room in the house, and that was the billiard room. Custer's man cave, as I like to think of it. Now, the parlor gets a lot of attention in the history books. We have photos of people listening to music in the parlor. I don't recall ever seeing a photo anywhere of the billiard room. According to our guide, this is another example of a change that was made from the first house to the second house. This was originally 2 bedrooms, and the Custers, in their second house, decided to break down the wall and open it up for more entertainment space. So you have an example in there of a replica billiard table today, as well as a table for card games. Custer did not drink, but he was an enthusiastic gambler throughout his life, much to Libby's chagrin. We can imagine a share of late night poker games occurring up here in this room. And again, it would have been a space, though, to entertain the officers as well, build camaraderie, build that Custer clan clique, so to speak. And as I said, for my money, this was perhaps the coolest room in the house. Okay, now, besides the parlor, if there was one room in the house that I was eager to see, it was the study. And that's because, as we see here, there's a couple very frequently reproduced photos of George and Libby studying at the desk in their study. So I wanted to see this. I was a little disappointed when I realized that the current layout of the study does not match the layout in these photos. But then it occurred to me, these photos are November 1873 and therefore would predate the February 1874 fire. So in other words, these often reproduced pictures are from the prior house and the prior study. Now, I don't know how the floor plan of the study actually changed pre-fire and post-fire, but as the study is situated today, it is clearly different from these photographs. But don't let my slight disappointment discourage you, or don't confuse that as criticism of how things are done at the fort. Like everything else at Fort Abraham Lincoln, the office is beautifully reconstructed, decorated, furnished, and there's some really cool stuff. Copy of a life insurance policy on the desk, photos on the wall of Custer, of Libby in her wedding dress, Phil Sheridan, George McClellan is represented there. Stuffed heads mounted on the walls, perhaps representing Custer's own interest in being an outdoor sportsman as well as taxidermy at the time. But when I think of the study and I think of them at the desk, I like to think of George Custer pursuing his writing career from here. The occasional newspaper article, the Galaxy magazine articles, which of course became bundled together into his autobiography, My Life on the Plains. Some authors have speculated that Libby might have directly or indirectly contributed to George's writing, and that certainly makes sense, knowing what we know about her own later writing career. But nevertheless, it was interesting for me to walk through this room and kind of ponder how much of George's writing might have actually occurred in the study. The last room we're going to explore in the house is the Custer master bedroom. Now, the room is decorated with period furniture, and our guide tells us that the rocking chair might be one that actually belonged to Mrs. Custer. We also hear the story about how the Custers were in bed that February night when Libby was awakened by the fire, which destroyed the first house in a chimney above this room. When the house was rebuilt, Custer added a door right behind Keith McGill that led to the outside. But while we were here, I found my thoughts turning to that July 1876 morning when Libby Kuster was awoken to the news of the Little Bighorn disaster. Now, supposedly there had been whispers among Indians camped near the fort for days of a big battle. On June 25th, while the battle was likely in progress, Libby had hosted some of the tense, worried wives in the Kuster House. But official news arrived when the casualty-laden Far West, after traveling a record 710 miles in 54 hours, pulled into Bismarck around 11 p.m. on July 5th. General Terry's official dispatch was then delivered to Captain William McCaskey of the 20th Infantry, who was acting post commander in Custer's absence. McCaskey then woke up the post surgeon and other officers probably as early as 2 a.m. on July 6th, and they began the task of knocking on doors to inform the widows and families, beginning, of course, with Libby Kuster. Libby was surprised by visitors at such an early hour, but she likely realized that this meant important news, and so she met McCaskey's party in the parlor. There she was informed that at 34 years of age, she was now a widow. Not only had she lost her husband, but two other Custer brothers, Tom and Boston, Maggie Custer's husband, Lieutenant James Calhoun, and many friends, such as fellow Gettysburg veteran Captain George Yates, were also among the dead. As Libby later wrote,
I wanted to die.
Margaret Custer Calhoun called out to the party, "Is there no message for me?" But after being informed, Libby wrapped herself in a shawl as she accompanied McCaskey to tell the other wives. Now, some writers have this traumatized woman shivering in the intense July heat, but we should remember it was likely only 7 a.m., and even hot days begin coolly out here. As widows, Libby, Maggie, and the other wives had no rights to Army quarters, and they had to prepare to leave Fort Lincoln. Libby turned most of the household goods over to the post trader to sell, while other, more personal items were shipped east. On July 30th, 1876, they boarded a special railroad car at Bismarck provided by the Northern Pacific Railroad. The party arrived in Monroe, Michigan on August 4th, and from there, Libby Kuster began almost 57 years of widowhood. And so as we depart the Kuster House, I do want to point out, again, that this is not the only structure on site at Fort Abe, but it is the most developed one, and for obvious reasons, the most popular one. There is one peripheral connection to Gettysburg that I didn't mention before. The actual fort was abandoned in 1891, and shortly thereafter, local residents disassembled the fort for nails and wood. And eventually in the early 1900s, Teddy Roosevelt signed over the original fort's land to the state, and it became a state park. Anyways, here's the Gettysburg connection. In the 1930s, the Civilian Conservation Corps, also known as the CCC, began work on a visitor center and other infrastructure improvements in this state park. One of the things they did was they reconstructed some military blockhouses, and they placed cornerstones to mark where the fort buildings once stood. So, among other things, that's how we generally would know where these buildings stood. Well, the Gettysburg connection, as probably some of you might know, during that same period, the CCC was also active here in Pennsylvania, working on and building the infrastructure of what would become known as Gettysburg National Military Park. It's a tenuous connection, but this is the Battle of Gettysburg podcast, after all. So as we walk the grounds, Jeff showed us the hospital site, and while we no doubt want to think of battle wounds being treated here, probably the main illnesses treated at this hospital were things like scurvy, dysentery, cholera, venereal disease, and the like. And as we often say on Civil War battlefields, the same was true here. Many more soldiers would have died from disease here at Fort Lincoln than they did from actual battle. The 1876 Little Bighorn battle notwithstanding. But from the hospital site, we walked over to the site of the guardhouse. And I'm going to let Jeff pick things up here as he's going to talk about the story or the legend of Rain in the Face and Tom Custer.
All right, we are at the guardhouse at Fort Abraham Lincoln State Park, and this is one of the buildings that's was original to the fort when it was established in 1873. Now, when I say 1873, I'm really talking about just the cavalry post, all right? It becoming Fort Abraham Lincoln, because before that we still have Fort McKeen up on the hill, the infantry post, starting from 1872. But in 1873, all of this expands. This is one of the sites of one of the buildings that was really integral to the operation of a post, because what is central to the military but good order and discipline and punishment? And this is where soldiers would be sent when they were misbehaving, when they were maybe not following the rules, or maybe they just ticked a sergeant or an officer off. They would end up in here. Now, in 1874, Rain in the Face, who was an Indian warrior, he was down at Standing Rock Agency, which is just to the south of here, about 40 miles, 45 miles or so. And he had caused some trouble during the Black Hills expedition, and it was rumored that he killed at least one veterinarian that was a part of that expedition, a guy by the name of Honsinger, and then another gentleman whose name escapes me right at the moment. But in any case, he was down at Standing Rock bragging about this in about November of 1874, 1875, and Custer got wind of this, and he detached his brother, as well as, if I'm not mistaken, George Yates, who was the captain commanding the bandbox troop, Company F, which was one of the spit and polish units here at Fort Abraham Lincoln, to go down and apprehend him. So off they went, Custer and Yates, Tom Custer that is, and Yates, and they ended up wrestling him to the floor after they located him in the settler store down there, the trader's post. They ended up forcibly bringing him back here, and he was put in the stockade, sentenced to a certain amount of time in the stockade. Well, he was so put out, when I say he, I'm really talking about Rain in the Face, was so unenamored by Tom Custer's takedown of him, which really was nothing short of an ambush, that he vowed to get revenge on Tom Custer. And this extended to wanting to basically eviscerate his remains and tear his heart out and take a bite out of it. And this whole thing ended up growing, especially after the fact that Rain in the Face escaped one night from this stockade and fled. Now, it is said that he actually was treated pretty well while he was incarcerated. But he did escape one night and made his way back. Now, fast forward to June of 1876, the Custer family is about to have a really bad day on that day, and Tom Custer is one of the soldiers that is going to fall on Last Stand Hill, otherwise known as Custer Hill. Tom Custer's remains were treated so badly. They were so, the mutilations that occurred to his remains were horrendous. His head was squashed flat as a pancake. He'd been scalped twice. His arms and legs had been slashed horribly. He had been eviscerated. His entrails had supposedly been removed, and he had been pincushioned with arrows to such a degree that they had to actually pry his body off the ground, and he was stuck to the earth. And one of the legends that occurred was that Rain in the Face took his revenge on Tom Custer for the incident at Standing Rock, and actually did eviscerate Tom Custer himself after he identified him after the battle and pulled out Tom Custer's heart and took a bite of it and spat that out. It's one of the legends that survives, not only about the Little Bighorn fight in June of 1876, but also of Fort Abraham Lincoln, because this is where it happened, ladies and gentlemen.
The legend of Rain in the Face, cutting out Custer's heart, was popularized by the poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow in his poem, The Revenge of Rain in the Face. There is no evidence, though, that this happened, and later in life, Rain in the Face denied killing George Custer or mutilating Tom Custer. Next up, we took a quick look at the reproduced stables and the barracks. Now remember, Fort Abe was only constructed to house 6 companies of cavalry. And as most good Little Bighorn enthusiasts know, the regiment never served together with all 12 companies prior to the 1876 campaign. So the barracks were designed in wings. They were designed to house 44 men per wing for a total complement of 88 men per barracks. And of course, this would vary depending on company's size and how many people were here at any given time. So you can see each soldier had a bunk. They then had a footlocker at the base of the bunk to store their personal items. Located in the middle of the barracks would have been a stove for heating. A fireplace also stood at the end of each barracks. And you can see gun racks throughout the barracks for which the soldiers could store their weapons. And yes, those are replica firearms stored there today, not the real thing. The barracks then also had a mess hall addition, which would include some dining areas and kitchens for the men to take their mess, or eat, as we civilians say. There would also be a separate washing area, and I should point out, separate living quarters for the first sergeant of each company. And one thought that occurs to me as we tour through the barracks, it's a stark reminder to me how these soldiers, these men of the 7th or any other cavalry regiment out on the plains, it's a reminder to me how these men lived, and in some cases died, with their company. You see that. They lived together, they slept together, they ate together. It was the company which formed the identity for many of these troopers.
Fishermen out there. Let's help the boat go.
As I said way back in the beginning of this video, Fort Lincoln sat along the Missouri River. And here is some video of the Missouri River. So right now we are on the eastern side of the fort. That would be the side that faced the river. The town, now today city of Bismarck, would have been to the upper left-hand side on the other side of the river. And we're standing right now just below the barracks and the stables. So you have your men and horses near the water. Jeff and Scott tell us that both the width and the depth of the Missouri River today don't quite match what they would have been in 1876. Nevertheless, you can still stand here and look at this and imagine the difficulties that members of the 7th Cavalry or residents of the fort would have had crossing this river to get over to Bismarck. It's no surprise that when we went up to the post cemetery up near Fort McKeen, that many of the gravestones up there were labeled cause of death, drowning, as soldiers or civilians were trying to get back and forth across the river. And Libby Kuster and others write about this in their own accounts. Of course, I mentioned the Far West earlier, which brought news of the Little Bighorn disaster and the wounded back to Bismarck and Fort Abraham Lincoln. Of course, I think of the Far West as I'm looking at the river here. And later in the day, when we were touring through Bismarck, Jeff did take us to the gravesite of Grant Marsh, skipper, captain of the Far West. And here is a shot of Grant Marsh's grave. As we start to conclude our visit and look out over the parade ground, I've saved one of the fort's most memorable historic incidents for nearly last. That would be the departure of General Alfred Terry's Dakota column, including Custer's 7th Cavalry, on May 17, 1876, during the Great Sioux War, which ultimately resulted in the Battle of Little Bighorn. Now, my intent here is not to go into the causes of the war. That has been done in many, many other forums, and this video is frankly long enough already. But as we look out over the parade ground, let's just stick with their departure from the fort. Remember, it had been General Phil Sheridan's original intent to launch a winter campaign with 3 columns in the field, but a number of factors delayed the Dakota column's departure until mid-May. One of those delays was the fact that Custer had been summoned to Washington to testify against the Grant administration before a House committee. This angered Grant, who wanted the expedition to leave without Custer, but as all good Little Bighorn enthusiasts know, President Grant was ultimately persuaded by Generals Sheridan and Terry to let Custer participate in the campaign, but only as commander of his regiment. So General Terry, who by this point in his career was really a desk jockey, Terry retained command of the Dakota column, and it was, on paper, a formidable one. Besides all 12 companies of the 7th Cavalry under Custer, there were 3 companies of infantry, Gatling guns, which of course were not used, guides, interpreters, scouts, wagons, and pack mules for a total force of nearly 1,100 men. Correspondent Mark Kellogg accompanied the expedition and would be killed with Custer on June 25th. Kellogg wrote, quote, General George A. Custer, dressed in a dashing suit of buckskin, is prominent everywhere, here, there, flitting to and fro in his quick, eager way, taking in everything connected with his command, as well as generally with the keen, incisive manner for which he is so well known. The general is full of perfect readiness for the fray with the hostile Red Devils. It should be noted that Libby Kuster always worried about the safety of her husband, Audie. But nevertheless, Libby claimed to have a premonition of disaster prior to this campaign, greater than one she had ever known before. And it's because of Libby, in part, that this supernatural premonition stuff tends to infiltrate the Little Bighorn literature. Whether you believe that stuff or not, let's pick up Libby Kuster's account of the morning of May 17th.
With my husband's departure on May 17th, my last happy days in garrison were ended. As a premonition of disaster that I had never known before weighed me down, I could not shake off the baleful influence of depressing thoughts.
Lieutenant Edward Godfrey, commanding Company K of the 7th, described the departure. Quote, "On the 17th of May at 5 a.m., the general was sounded, the wagons were packed and sent to the quartermaster, and by 6 o'clock the wagon train was on the road, escorted by the infantry. By 7 o'clock the 7th Cavalry was marching in column of platoon around the parade ground of Fort Lincoln, headed by the band playing Gary Owen, the 7th's battle tune first used when the regiment charged at the Battle of Washita. The column was halted and dismounted just outside the garrison. The officers and married men were permitted to leave the ranks to say goodbye to their families. General Terry, knowing the anxiety of the ladies, had assented to or ordered this demonstration in order to allay their fears and satisfy them by the formidable appearance we made, that we were able to cope with any enemy that we might expect to meet. Not many came out to witness the pageant, but many tearful eyes looked from the windows." There's one thing I want to point out, as it's relevant to this next segment. You might be looking at my photos and videos today and kind of thinking, geez, why are these images so washed out? There's no blue sky. Did Jim mess up the video settings again? Is he just a lousy photographer? Well, I'm happy to answer no to those accusations. On the day that we were on site in the summer of 2025, the sky was filled with a significant haze from Canadian forest fires. So that's why you have this gray sort of washed out imagery in all of my photos. That has relevance to this segment because as the Dakota column marched away from the fort to the hills to the west, Libby Kuster recorded what has become a well-known passage, a sort of mirage formed on the sky. And I think we pick up a little bit of that atmosphere on this hazy day. But let's pick it up in Libby's words. And as we listen to Libby, I'm pointing to the hills to the west of the fort in which she supposedly witnessed this mirage.
When our band struck up, the girl I left behind me, the most despairing hour seemed to have come. From the hour of breaking camp before the sun was up and mist had enveloped everything. Soon the bright sun began to penetrate this veil and dispel the haze, and a scene of wonder and beauty appeared. The cavalry and infantry in the order named, the scouts, pack mules, and artillery, and behind all the long line of white-covered wagons, made a column altogether some 2 miles in length. As the sun broke, the mist and mirage appeared, which took up about half of the line of cavalry, and thenceforth for a little distance it marched, equally plain to the sight on the earth and in the sky. The future of the heroic band, whose days were even then numbered, seemed to be revealed, and already There seemed a premonition in the supernatural translation, as their forms were reflected from the opaque mist of the early dawn.
And we have now moved up into those hills, overlooking the cavalry post at Fort Abraham Lincoln, onto the site of the infantry post. And the hills here would have been the ones that Libby was describing in her account. After the brief halt that Godfrey described in his account, Godfrey goes on to write, quote, "During this halt, the wagon train was assembled on the plateau west of the post and formed in column of fours. When it started off, the assembly was sounded and absentees joined their commands. The signals mount and forward were sounded, and the regiment marched away, the band playing The Girl I Left Behind Me." As we depart the cavalry post and head into the hills to look at the infantry post, just a few final words on this not-so-little video. As we said way back at the beginning, this was originally established in 1872 as Fort McKeen, an infantry post. Now, Fort McKeen was named after Colonel Boyd McKeen. Boyd McKeen commanded the 81st Pennsylvania of Cross's brigade in the wheat field at Gettysburg. And in fact, when Edward Cross was mortally wounded, it was McKeen who became acting commander of the brigade. So there's a Gettysburg connection. McKeen was a very brave officer who was ultimately killed at Cold Harbor. But as we said earlier, the name of the post was changed to Fort Abraham Lincoln, another Gettysburg connection, by the way, in November of 1872, and the cavalry arrived shortly thereafter. But the infantry remained, and that's often forgotten. The infantry posts up here on the bluffs were protected by blockhouses and on the north and west sides by palisades. It was felt that the rugged terrain to the south and the east would help discourage attacks from that direction. The palisades, however, were difficult to maintain, and they were removed in 1873. The Civilian Conservation Corps, or the CCC that we mentioned earlier, they rebuilt the blockhouses and palisades in the 1930s, but again, the palisades were dismantled because of the same maintenance problems. The reconstructed blockhouses do remain up here, and I would certainly encourage you, if you're coming all the way out here to Fort Abe, not to forget about the infantry, the grunts, the foot soldiers up here in the hills. The reconstructed infantry post is a site worth visiting. Libby Kuster did, in fact, describe visiting the wives of the infantry post. So let's turn it over one more time to Jody as Libby.
The post was located in a valley, while just back of us stretched a long chain of bluffs. On the summit of a hill, nearly a mile to the left, was a small infantry garrison, which had been established some time, and now belonged to our post. When we went to return the visits of the infantry ladies, the mules dragged the ambulance up the steep hill with difficulty. We found living in this bleak place, in small, shabbily built quarters, such as a day laborer would consider hardly good enough for his family. Delicate women and children who, as usual, made no complaint about their life.
And now we make our final stop at the post cemetery. Let's face it, most good historians love an old cemetery. And frankly, I thought it would be appropriate because, let's face it, death is something we all have coming. So this is something we can all relate to. So here, high up on the hills, with the infantry overlooking the cavalry, are the remains of the post cemetery. Now, the bodies are no longer here after Fort Abraham Lincoln was abandoned. The remains of soldiers were reburied in the Custer National Cemetery at the Little Bighorn battlefield, and the bodies of civilian workers and children who died at the fort were either claimed by relatives or, if unclaimed, were reinterred at a cemetery in Mandan. So the bodies are not here right now, but they have maintained or recreated headstones to give us a sense of who was once here. Interpretation tells us that Charles Page, a civilian worker at the fort who froze to death in the fall of 1873, was the first recorded burial here. But there are all types of graves and causes of death here: gunshot wounds, illnesses, injuries, soldiers, civilians, scouts, and yes, children are here. So it's always a somber sight to see the old cemetery. After the Battle of Little Bighorn, of course, when the far west brought casualties back to Fort Lincoln, those who died of wounds during or after the trip were buried here in the cemetery. As we started to exit the cemetery, the replica headstone of John Noonan, 7th Cavalry, died November 30th, 1878, of course, caused us to pause and elicited no small amount of conversation. Little Bighorn enthusiasts are mostly familiar with this salacious story, but here it was another reminder again that most of that story lived and died here at Fort Abe. Noonan was an enlisted man of long service, both in the military and within the 7th Cavalry. You see on his headboard that it says corporal, for example. If you look at his record, he was a private, a corporal, a sergeant, then he was busted back down to private again, worked his way up to corporal, and then sergeant, and so on. This, again, was not terribly uncommon in the ranks of the regiment. During the Battle of Little Bighorn, Noonan was left behind at the Powder River Depot, and therefore not in the battle. Noonan was married and lived at Fort Lincoln with his wife, who was a popular midwife. Corporal Noonan was apparently Mrs. Noonan's third husband. Unfortunately, in the fall of 1878, while Noonan was away on service, Mrs. Noonan died on post. And I'll pick up with a dispatch from Bismarck dated October 31st, 1878. Quote, "Mrs. Sergeant Noonan, who died last night, turns out to be a man. Mrs. Noonan was a laundress at the post and a most popular midwife. She was married 3 times. Her husband is a member of the 7th Cavalry, now in the field. There is no explanation of this unnatural union, except that the supposed Mexican woman was worth $10,000 and was able to buy her husband's silence. She has been with the 7th Cavalry for 9 years. Well, as the story goes, when Noonan came back to the post and was horrified to find out that his wife had passed away and also that their secret had been discovered, supposedly Noonan then became the butt of many jokes within the regiment. And so it goes on November 30th, 1878, again reading from another dispatch, quote, "Corporal Noonan shot and killed himself at Fort A. Lincoln. He was the third husband of the supposed woman who recently died at Fort A. Lincoln, but proved to be a perfectly formed man." We should note, too, that although his headboard seems to say Company I, he was in fact serving with Company L, and he reportedly shot himself in the company's stable. Noonan rests today in the Custer National Cemetery at the Little Bighorn battlefield.
Visit our website at the Battle of Gettysburg Podcast.com to shop, buy some new merch, check in on our upcoming events, and of course, buy Civil War books from one of your favorite podcasters.
And on that note, we are going to wrap up our visit at Fort Abraham Lincoln. What might have seemed like it was going to start as a tribute to the reconstructed Kuster House hopefully has developed into a more comprehensive view of the fort and life on the post-Civil War Western frontier, and hopefully you learned something from it. I know I did by visiting it. We all know we are not shy about promoting our own books on the Battle of Gettysburg podcast, nor are we not shy about promoting things that helped us out. If you want to read more about this, I would recommend Fort Abraham Lincoln, Dakota Territory by Lee Chambers. We picked up a copy for ourselves in the post gift shop, and it was certainly a assistance to me in producing this video. Fort Abraham Lincoln, Dakota Territory by Lee Chambers.
Jeff, that was great. We had such a good time here today. I've got Wayne Motts. I've got Warren Motts. We talked about Scott. I've got Keith McGill, Casey Turbin from Addressing Winchester. On behalf of all of us, we want to thank you for showing us around today, and this has been a fantastic experience. Folks, if you're anywhere near Mandan, North Dakota, and who isn't, right? You got to come out and see Fort Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah, absolutely. This place, like I said before, this place is a real gem, and if you're interested in not just the Indian Wars but the Civil War, this really is one of the sites to see in present-day Dakota Territory.
Thanks. Thank you.
You bet. Oh.
Make sure you check out our friends at the Research Arsenal, proud supporters of the Battle of Gettysburg podcast.